Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. On September 14th, 2001, only 3 days after the most catastrophic terrorist attacks in American history, the newly elected 43rd President George W. Bush stood on top of the rubble of what used to be the Twin Towers. Carrying a large megaphone in his hand, surrounded by firefighters, rescue workers, and thousands of Americans still searching through the wreckage, the crowd struggled to hear him over the noise. Somebody shouted in the distance that they couldn't hear what Bush was saying. Bush smiled and replied with the now famous quote, "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." Overwhelmed with patriotism, the entire crowd erupts in cheers, and it became one of the most defining moments of his entire presidency. And now, one of the most memorable presidential moments ever in history. But how does the son of a former president ever step out of his father's shadow? George W. Bush spent much of his life answering that exact question. While he shared many similarities to his father, George H.W. Bush, the differences between the two men would define entirely different eras. This is the story of George W. Bush. Let's do this. George Walker Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut. He was born while his father still attended Yale University, after returning home from his service in World War II. Before long, however, the Bush family packed their bags and headed south to Midland, Texas, a completely different environment from the prestigious area of Yale University. In Texas, the oil industry was booming. And unlike his father, George H.W. Bush, who'd grown up in the Northeast, George W. Bush became a Texan through and through. The culture, the people, the personality, the sayings of Texas shaped much of the man who would eventually become the president. But his childhood was not without heartbreak. When George was just 7 years old, his younger sister Robin died of leukemia at only 3 years old. The loss deeply affected the Bush family, especially his mother, eventual First Lady Barbara Bush. And while the family rarely spoke about the loss publicly, Bush would later reflect on how that tragedy changed him forever. He attended Phillips Academy before following in his father's footsteps to Yale University, where he earned his bachelor's degree before becoming the first future president to receive a master's in business administration from Harvard Business School. there's no denying that Bush benefited from some extraordinary opportunities. His family's name and popularity opened doors that most Americans could never experience. But those opportunities also came with tremendous expectations. But rather than avoiding them, Bush leaned into his business, his leadership, and his public life image, spending years working in the Texas oil industry while learning firsthand both success and failure. His business ventures produced mixed results at best, but they gave him valuable experience and resilience, something that would come in handy if he'd ever run for president. But one of the most important turning points in Bush's life came not in politics, but personally. When Bush turned 40 years old, after years of heavy drinking, Bush decided to quit alcohol. Influenced by his Christian faith and encouraged by those closest to him, he later described the decision as one that transformed his life for the better. Good job, George. That renewed sense of purpose would become central to both his personal life and eventually his presidency. And as his father rose through national politics, serving as Ronald Reagan's vice president before becoming president himself in 1989, George W. Bush remained closely involved. He frequently visited Washington, he offered political advice, and became one of the trusted voices his father listened to. But despite carrying one of the most recognizable names in American politics, Bush never seemed interested in becoming a carbon copy of his father. He wanted to build his own political identity. And before entering elected office, he had to have some fun when he made the most surprising career move ever by joining an ownership group that purchased the Texas Rangers baseball team. So George W. Bush was not just the 43rd president of the United States, he was also the partial owner of the Texas Rangers. As the club's managing general partner, he became the face of the organization. He helped oversee the construction of a new stadium. You're probably listening to this and wondering, what does this have to do with George Bush's political career? Well, this position helped him build relationships all across Texas. The experience also sharpened his leadership skills and made him a familiar face to voters all across the state. And in 1994, Bush challenged incumbent Governor Ann Richards and won, becoming the governor of Texas. Ann Richards had been one of the state's most influential modern governors, making Bush's victory all the more significant in the great state of Texas. But what was Bush going to do as governor? He emphasized education reform, accountability in schools, tax relief programs, and bipartisan cooperation. His optimistic style became known as compassionate conservatism, which was an effort to combine conservative principles with practical solutions that appealed to a broad range of voters. His popularity led to his re-election in 1998, making him the first Texas governor elected to consecutive four-year terms after the state expanded gubernatorial, one of my favorite words, gubernatorial terms from 2 years to 4. By 1999, many Republicans believed that Bush was the party's strongest candidate for the White House. And when he announced his campaign for president, people were excited. He secured the Republican nomination, but he faced Vice President Al Gore in one of the most chaotic and closest elections in American history. Gore won the national popular vote by more than 500,000 votes, but the presidency ultimately came down to Florida, where the margin separating the candidates was literally only a few hundred votes. Recounts, hanging chads, legal battles, and the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore turned just a normal election into drama unlike anything Americans had ever witnessed. And if you want to know more about that incredible story, make sure to check out my Season 2 episode, 537 Votes, The Election of 2000. Bush had survived one of the closest elections in American history. He'd finally reached the highest office in the world. The campaign was finally over. He can relax, put his hands up, and just chill out for a little bit. But little did Bush know that the most evil terrorist attack in our country's history would occur only 9 months into his first presidential term. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Roosevelt was the president for over 4,000 days. These are facts. But you know what else is a fact? The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. That is presidents_unplugged. I'll see you there. On September 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. 2 struck the Twin Towers in New York City. 1 crashed into the Pentagon, and another went down in a Pennsylvania field after the passengers courageously fought back against the terrorists. Almost 3,000 innocent people lost their lives that day, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. The attacks forever changed the nation and instantly transformed Bush from a newly elected president into a wartime leader. And if you'd like to hear the complete story of the tragic day in 2001, I covered in much greater detail in my other Season 2 episode, Towers, Terror, and Tragedy. In the months that followed 9/11, Bush declared a global war on terror. While terrorist attacks against American interests had occurred throughout the 1990s, 9/11 convinced many leaders that a dramatically different approach was necessary. This wasn't a fluke. It was becoming a pattern. The United States invaded Afghanistan with the goal of dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban government that had provided Osama bin Laden and his organization a safe haven. Initially, the invasion in Afghanistan received overwhelming bipartisan and international support. At home, Bush signed the USA Patriot Act, which expanded our intelligence capabilities and created the Department of Homeland Security, fundamentally reshaping America's national security structure completely. And many of those institutions and policies continue to influence everyday American life decades later. But in 2003, Bush made what would become the most debated decision of his entire presidency, when he ordered the invasion of Iraq. Bush's administration, led by figures like Dick Cheney, argued that Saddam Hussein possessed or was actively pursuing weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, and warned that waiting for absolute proof in the aftermath of something like 9/11 could prove disastrous. What else could they do? Those conclusions were based on intelligence assessments available at the time, and Bush made the case publicly in the months leading up to the invasion. Some critics later argued that long-standing tensions between Saddam Hussein and Bush's father when he was president may have influenced the decision, pointing to when in 1993 there was an Iraqi plot to assassinate former President George H.W. Bush during his visit to Kuwait. Bush consistently denied that claim, maintaining that the invasion was based solely on national security concerns and nothing else. But as this war continued for what seemed to go on forever, no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The conflict seemed to go on and on and on, and thousands of American service members lost their lives. Countless Iraqis were caught in the violence, and public support for the war steadily declined. For many Americans, Iraq raised questions similar to those asked during the Vietnam War. Why are we still there? What does victory look like? And how many more lives will this require? The debates surrounding Iraq became one of the defining features of Bush's entire presidency. And it also highlighted something unique about George W. Bush himself. He had a natural propensity to connect with people on a personal level. Propensity is our word of the day. Propensity is a natural tendency or preference to act, feel, or behave in a specific way. Supporters appreciated Bush's straightforward, conversational style and his optimistic outlook. While critics often questioned his policies, it was very apparent that deep down, George W. Bush was kind of just a goofball. His occasional verbal slip-ups and his quirks became so famous that they got their own nickname, and it's also part of the title of this episode, Bushisms. Whether he was accidentally completely botching an expression that was said in Texas, enthusiastically playing traditional drums during a visit to Senegal, or laughing at himself after briefly losing consciousness from choking on a pretzel while watching football in the White House. And by the way, George W. Bush choked on this pretzel exactly 8 years before I was born, to the day, on January 13th, 2002. Bush rarely ever seemed concerned with appealing perfect or polished to the public, because behind the presidency was a man who often came across as approachable, humorous, and undeniably human. But before Bush could leave office, one more enormous challenge arrived. In 2008, the housing market collapsed after years of risky lending and soaring home prices. Banks failed, financial markets plunged, businesses struggled, and millions of Americans lost jobs, savings, and homes. It became the most significant economic downturn since the Great Depression. When looking at the entire Bush presidency, the contrast of public opinion is unbelievable. Following the attacks of 9/11, Bush's approval rating was at roughly 90%. That is the highest approval rating ever recorded for an American president since the approval system was created. But by the end of his presidency, it had fallen below 30%, one of the lowest in history. George W. Bush became one of the most admired and one of the most criticized presidents of the modern era. But perhaps that says much about the extraordinary period that he was the president. Whether history ultimately views those choices as good or bad remains an open debate. What's certain is that George W. Bush was never simply George H.W. Bush's son. He became the president who led America through 9/11, launched the war on terror, navigated 2 controversial wars, and left office during one of the worst financial crises in the modern era. His decisions did not stay in the early 2000s. They helped shape the America we live in today and will continue influencing the America of tomorrow. And no matter where you stand on George W. Bush, during one of the darkest moments in our nation's history, he reminded our grieving country of something that still remains true today. These acts of evil may have shattered steel, but they could never dent the steel of American resolve. And that is why George W. Bush is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Millard Fillmore. Who? Millard Fillmore? Yes, Millard Fillmore became president after his boss died from eating too many cherries and milk during a July 4th celebration. I became the president because my boss died drinking milk and eating cherries. Yeah, Fillmore might be the most forgettable president in American history. But I don't really know why. Because Millard Fillmore's decisions were vital to keeping America together or ripping it farther apart. Did Millard Fillmore truly save the United States? Or did he push us closer to civil war? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.